All right, hey gang, I know you must miss the classroom so much now that you're all alone at home. We're gonna start evolution now. This is gonna be your evolution lecture. I tried doing it as like one of those screencast things where you see my head and then you can see the notes beside my head. But unfortunately, for some reason, the Microsoft, I'm using something called Microsoft Stream to do that, and it keeps crashing and it's erased two of my videos. So we're gonna do it this way because I know that this way, for the most part, works, and I don't have time. Okay, so I sort of have to show you the notes here so you can follow along with the notes, but mainly this is just going to be me yammering on about the notes. So we're doing evolution. Important topic. Was controversial, so like in the last few years. I don't think it is anymore. I don't know. So have a look at the notes. So open up the notes in OneNote there, and you'll see at the top, development of the modern theory of evolution. So what happened was, for most of human history, I guess people didn't really think about where animals came from, or at least, there was all various kinds of religions and things that came up with it. And basically, no one really noticed that if animals changed or not. It was just assumed that they were perfect the way they were. They didn't change. Species didn't happen. The animals that we had are just the animals that we have, and they have never changed. And that was the best info that people had at the time, and so that's what they believed, and that's what they used. But of course, there were some contradictory observations that people were starting to make, and science was starting to make inroads. Now, this is around the 1600s, so that's a lot of humanity that has happened until then. But so in the 1600s, you started to have a real scientific method where people were making observations and hypothesis and all that stuff, that good stuff that we learned about earlier. And so one of the things that people noticed was that in the ground were fossils. And fossils were a very strange thing. Initially people thought that these were dragons or some kind of beasts. I think that's what it was. Here, I'm going to put you in a little stand here because my arm's getting tired. That they thought that these were dragons. But, as time went on, as science grew broader, people, started to realize that maybe these superstitions and things aren't necessarily right. Let me just see if we're still filming because, yeah, we are. Okay, good. There we go. Sorry, technology. So what are fossils? So you see, if you look in your notes, you'll see there's this, that looks like a Tyrannosaurus head Rex in there. So fossils aren't actually bones. What happens is there has to be very specific conditions for a fossil to happen. Not everything that dies just turns into a fossil. Actually, very few things, very small percentage of things turn into a fossil because there have to be very specific kind of conditions. We're not going to go into the details of the conditions are, but essentially an animal's body has to be buried in a kind of mud or volcanic ash or the kind of like river sediment and very quickly, so that it doesn't decompose, so that bacteria and funguses and things don't destroy all of the evidence. Or, if something dies, it is exposed and the bones are exposed to the outside air, those bones will crumble. Things will still eat the bone, even though it's bone. Or animals and birds will scatter the bones and things like that. But if it's buried in its sediment, and it's let's say it's a really acidic mud, so that bacteria can't grow in it really well. What might happen is these bones, they stay in there for a very long time, and water flowing through the bones, basically, bones are kind of spongy. Water flowing through the bones brings with it minerals. So all of these things have to happen. So these minerals, as they flow through, let's say, the mud or the sand, they enter the bone, and because the bone is a little bit denser than the sand, they get stuck. These minerals get stuck in the bone. And eventually, very slowly, over a very, very long time, we're talking years and years, maybe thousands of years, all of the bone gets replaced by minerals, essentially rock. So the bone gets turned into rock. So when you see fossils, those are actually rocks that are in the shape of the bones that they replaced. And what people started to observe when they looked at these bones is that they don't resemble any of the creatures living on Earth today. Some of them don't. Some of them do. Some of them sort of resemble the creatures living on Earth today. So if all the creatures that were created are supposed to be perfect, well, were these not perfect? What happened to these? It started to bring up all these questions. The other thing that raises questions is about this idea that all creatures are perfect, they're all designed perfect, or whatever you want to say, is vestigial structures. So what vestigial structures are, these are non-functional organs and tissues that we carry that resemble functional organs and tissues in other animals. So flightless birds, for example, I'm thinking of like turkeys. Although some people say that turkeys do fly. Wasn't there like a movie or something about flying turkeys? I don't know. Anyways, turkeys don't fly, or chickens don't fly. They fly a little bit. Have feathers, flight feathers. I think penguins have flight feathers, and penguins definitely don't fly, not even close. So why would they have those if they don't fly? Better examples are like whales have pelvic bones, right? So bones that are designed to hold femurs for walking. But obviously whales don't walk on land, so why would they have pelvic bones? But these are just leftover, these are vestigial structures that are left over from when their ancestors did walk on land. Humans, we have an interesting vestigial structure. We have a few. I'm trying to think of what the one that I know about is the appendix. There's something about like earlobes or something, but appendix is the big one. So it's a part of your large intestine. Right at the start of large intestine is this little finger thing that sticks out, and actually food can go into it. And in other mammals and our cousins, it actually serves. Oh, of course, the phone is ringing. I'm going to have to pause it for a second. Okay. Apparently now they're charging for parking out there. Oh, great. Okay. Quickly continuing on. So I was talking about the appendix. So in our cousins, the appendix, a little thing in the small intestine, in the large intestine, and what happens is cellulose goes into there. So there'll be like very tough plant matter. And there's enzymes in the appendix that break down that plant matter. We don't have those enzymes. We still have the structure, but we don't make those enzymes anymore. We don't have to because we eat those animals that make those enzymes. So why bother making them? We eat the animals that digest cellulose. But we still have this. We still have that structure. And in fact, it's actually bad for us to have it, because what can happen is food can get lodged in there and irritate the structure in there and get stuck. And you can get an inflamed appendix, which means you get an immune response inside that appendix. You guys know all about that. And what can actually happen is it can burst, it can break open, and it can allow stomach acids, or the juices of digestion into the rest of your body. You don't want those in the rest of your body because they'll be digesting you. And so you can actually die from it. My friend Bob Fraser, that happened to him. He was like really sick, and we were working together, and he was really sick, and we were like, Bob, you got to go to the hospital. Something is wrong with you. He's like, no, I got to keep working. But he didn't die. He eventually went to the hospital. He had to be taken away actually by ambulance, and they were able to help him. So vestigial structures was another thing. So then people started to come up with theories on what's happening on these theories of evolution. And one way to describe evolution was this guy Jean de Lamarck. Came up with it. Remember, I'm not going to test you on the questions, but I will say something like Lamarck's theory, okay? So Lamarck's theory of use and disuse, okay? It says here us, and I'm just going to change that right now, of use and disuse. So what Lamarck's theory, the key here is that the organism's behavior leads to the change. That's the key to Lamarck's theory here, if there's like a key thing. It's the organism's behavior. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So Lamarck's, the most traditional one is this giraffes thing, okay? So the environment changes the organism's behavior. The organism's behavior changes what their progeny inherit. Now, we make fun of Lamarck's theory, but at the time, you have to realize people didn't know about DNA, none of this stuff. This is like 1800s, 1700s when Lamarck was coming up with this stuff. So this was actually a really good revolutionary theory, and it actually explained things actually okay. Now we think of it as a silly, but so the giraffes thing was, giraffes used to look like horses, and they had short necks. That was the theory. I presume that's true. Maybe there's fossils of short-necked giraffes. But so these giraffes, they were living, and maybe they were forced, or they moved to an area where the leaves that they ate, the plants that they ate, weren't down low anymore. They were up high. They were up higher in the trees. So the giraffes had to stretch their necks to reach those leaves. And when they stretched their necks would get a little bit longer because they were stretching them out. So they would get a little bit longer. And then when they had kids, because they had stretched their necks, their kids would have slightly longer necks. Now, of course, we know that that's not possible. That's silly. However, if we know that because of DNA, we know all this stuff that we did. At the time, in Lamarck's time, they didn't know that. So it kind of made sense. And so then imagine then their kids would stretch their necks, and their necks would be a little bit longer, and then those kids would have a little longer necks, and on and on and on and on until you've got these really long necks that can easily grab the leaves over many generations. The flip side on Lamarck's theory was that if you don't use something, it would get smaller and smaller and smaller and wither away. So, I drew some funny, I didn't draw them, but I downloaded some funny pictures here. I've got one there of Michael Phelps if you look in the notes. And so imagine if you don't use your arms would theoretically, Lamarck's theory, would get smaller and smaller and smaller, and you would have tiny Tyrannosaurus arms at some point. So the key to it was that the organism dictates the changes. And so inheritance is based on effort and will. But the good things in his theory was this idea of inheriting traits from your parents. That was actually a good idea, and as we know, it is actually true. The mechanism is different, but we do inherit our traits from our parents. As an aside, there's a funny thing. There's a guy named Weissman. I don't know if it's funny. It's not funny. It's grim. But you guys like my grim stories. But so anyways, this guy Weissman, he was this scientist, and he wanted to test, I think it was in the 1800s, he wanted to test Lamarck's theory. And I think Weissman was like really pro Lamarck's theory because there was a number of theories and they were all sort of arguing with each other. Lamarck's was sort of coming up on the top. And so Weissman was like, I'm going to show you that this works. And so what he did is he got mice, and he took the baby mice and he cut off their tails. He was German. So he would chop off their tails. And then so the mice would never use their tail because they didn't have a tail. So then according to Lamarck's theory, the disuse idea of it, so since the mice aren't using their tails, then their progeny, their kids, would have either no tails or smaller tails. And so Weissman did this over and over again. Every time the mice were born, he would cut off their tails. And the mice were born, he would cut off the tails. And then he would measure the tails of the kids and then cut them off, I suppose. The tails didn't get smaller, and there were no, they didn't turn into hamsters with little cute tails. So Lamarck's theory was in a way proven wrong. But like I said, the good thing about Lamarck's theory was that it talked about inheritance. That was one idea. It talked about inheritance. And the key to Lamarck's theory is that the organism drives the evolution. Okay? So next, one of the other competing theories was, of course, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So at this point, you should watch this video that I put in the notes, this fact versus theory versus hypothesis versus law explained, because it explains those words, what those words mean, because you may have heard that, evolution is just a theory. What does that mean? In science terms, theory is actually a very serious word. It's theory is a big deal. So this explains it. So watch that. So you have that. You have that going on. Okay. Oh, I have my office time with you shortly. Okay. So do we have time? Do we have time for me to go into? Okay. Well, I'm gonna talk about this natural selection. We'll stop there, and then tomorrow we'll talk about genome, genes, gene pool, and the rest of it. Maybe tonight I'll make a better video. Okay. So the keys. Well, what led to Darwin's theory of evolution, okay? Well, like I said, people were originally people thought that organisms were just the way they were, that they were perfect. There was kind of Lamarck's theory, but one thing that started leading to people was fossils, was finding fossils. The other thing was geology. So scientists had discovered, or were starting to learn, that the Earth wasn't 5,000 years old. People thought the Earth was like 5,000 years old. That's what it said in religious texts and things like that. But they started realizing, as they looked through rocks and started studying rocks and breaking rocks apart, that actually these rocks were potentially thousands of years old, more, millions of years old. We know now that there's actually billions, but I think at the time they were into millions. So it gave Darwin this idea that actually time, really deep time, it's called deep time. So time is really, really long. Things can happen slowly. The other idea that Darwin, so this is other people came up with this, so geologists, obviously. Darwin he read a book from a geologist. It says what his name is. It doesn't matter. Let's forget him. The other idea was, another guy came up with it, is that new species can come from old species. This was a radical idea. So you have one species and it can create a new species. And Darwin observed this. He also started to observe this on the Galapagos Islands. So he went on this big voyage. He was a super rich dude, so he paid to go on this big long voyage for like years. He could just travel and study and read on a boat going around the world. And they went to the Galapagos Islands. I don't remember what the name of the boat was Beagle, but I don't remember what its actual mission was. I don't think it was just a pleasure cruise for Darwin. And what Darwin noticed is they went to these islands. So there's all these small islands. They're pretty close together. They're kind of really far away from the mainland, from South America, from the mainland of South America. And what he noticed on this island was that there was these birds, these finches. And the finches were very similar, but varied slightly, and they seemed to be really suited. Each island had sort of its own food source that the finches would eat. So there was there was seeds on the ground, and there was seeds up on the trees, and there was leaves, and there was fruits. And each finch, its beak would be kind of suited to what it was eating. And they all sort of resembled the one kind of finch that lived on the mainland. And so he started to think maybe these finches were all related. Maybe the mainland finch got blown onto, there was a hurricane and it blew this mainland finch onto these islands, and they started a population, and they sort of adapted to meet the requirements of this new place. So new species were formed. So those were sort of the things that Darwin was thinking. So let's just do evolution in a nutshell, and we'll stop here. So in a nutshell, what are the key sort of postulates of evolution, or the key points of evolution are? Number one, organisms produce more offspring than their environment can support. So we have more kids. Animals have more kids or more babies than there is food and resources for those babies. That's number one. And it's kind of like nature is a dick. That's basically the postulate, because most kids are going to die. Now, humans, We really don't want our kids to die. We have less children, number one. Kids still die, but we fight very hard for our kids not to die. One of the things that we evolved is our super intelligent problem-solving brain that makes it so our kids don't die. We invented medicines, all these types of things. So that's number one. Organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. Nature is tough. Number two is that there's variation in those offspring. So if you have brothers or sisters, you have different traits, slightly different traits than your brothers or sisters. Your friends have different traits. There's this variability. Now, Darwin didn't know what fueled this variation. He wasn't sure, but now we know it's DNA. It's mutations in DNA. So changes in DNA that give organisms different features. We're not all the same. You aren't just a perfect mix of the genes from your mother and your father. You have some of your own special sauce in there. So variation in offspring. Now, so this variation gives some offspring an advantage over others, over their brothers or their sisters or the other families. It gives them an advantage. And so those offspring that have an advantage have features that are advantageous. Those kids live longer, reproduce, reach reproduction age, or just live longer so they reproduce more often. And then those traits are passed on to their offspring. And so those traits are more successful. So in the next generation, there will be more offspring with the advantageous traits. That's how this change happens. That's how a change in a population happens. So variation in the offspring gives some features that are better for surviving, some features that are not good. The survivors reach maturity and have more babies. Those with bad features, they don't. They have less offspring or they don't have offspring at all. The features for survival are passed on to the next generation. So that idea was very important. Remember, they didn't know about DNA. They didn't know about those things. And so Darwin took that idea from Lamarck. I don't know if he took it from Lamarck, but he had that idea that those features are passed on to the offspring. And now as the environment changes, the population it supports will change too. So in Darwin's idea, the difference between Darwin and Lamarck, the big difference is that actually the environment is what fuels evolution, what powers the change. It's not the organisms making the change. It's the environment selecting the ones that are the better adapted ones, the ones that are more successful. The environment is what does it. That's the big difference. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. That's enough of a start on evolution. We'll talk about genomes and genetics and stuff next, and the methods for evolution. We'll cover that tomorrow. So for now, get your big taxonomy assignment into me, and look at these notes, watch that video on what a theory is. Here, have one last look at the classroom. I hope this video is intelligible at all. I have no idea. The camera on the other side is wonky, so anyways, we're doing all things new.